You couldn't use gallons, stickles, and nuts in the muggle shops. He had never mentioned his Grindelwald's bank account to Dursleys. He didn't think their horror of anything connected with magic would stretch to a large pile of gold. Mrs. Weasley woke them up early that following Wednesday. After a quick half a dozen bacon sandwiches each, they pulled on their coats and Mrs. Weasley took a flower pot off the kitchen mantelpiece and peered inside. We're running low, Arthur, she sighed. We have to buy some more today. Guess first. After you, Harry dear. And she offered him the flower pot. He stared at them all, watching him. What am I supposed to do? He stammered. He's never traveled by Floo powder, said Ron suddenly. Sorry, Harry, I forgot. Never, said Mrs. Weasley. But how did you get into Diagon Alley to buy your school things last year? It went on the underground. Really? Said Mrs. Weasley eagerly. Were there any escapers? How exactly... Oh, Mr. Weasley. Really? Said Mr. Weasley eagerly. Were there any escapers? How exactly... Not now, Arthur, said Miss Weasley. Floo powder's a lot quicker, dear. But... Goodness me, if you've never used it before. He'll be all right, Mom, said Fred. Harry, watch us first. He took a pinch of glittering powder out of the flower pot, stepped up to the fire, and threw the powder into the flames. With a roar, the fire turned emerald green and rose higher than Fred, who stepped right into it, shouted, Diagon Alley, and vanished. You must speak clearly, dear, Mrs. Weasley told Harry as George dipped his hand into the flower pot. Oof, I probably have troubles with that then. And be sure to get out at the right gate. Great. The right what? Said Harry nervously as the fire roared and whipped George out of the sight too. Well, there's an awful lot of wizard fires to choose from, you know. But as long as you've spoken clearly. It'll be fine, Molly. Don't fuss, said Mr. Weasley, helping himself to Floo powder too. But dear, if he got lost, how would we ever explain to his aunt and uncle? They wouldn't mind, Harry reassured her. Dudley would think it was a brilliant joke if I got lost up in the chimney. Don't worry about that. Well, all right. You go after Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley. Shouldn't you be more concerned about that? They wouldn't care if he just disappeared or got lost somewhere. They would actually be grateful. Isn't that suspicious? Well, whatever. Well, all right. You go after Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley. Now, when you get into the fire, say where you're going. And keep your elbow tucked in, said Ron advised. And your eyes shut, said Mrs. Weasley. The suit. Don't fidget, said Ron, or you might well fall out the wrong fireplace. But don't panic and get out too early. Wait until you see Fred and George. Trying hard to bear all this in mind, Harry took a pinch of Floo powder and walked to the edge of the fire. He took a deep breath, Harry took a pinch of Floo powder and walked to the edge of the fire. He took a deep breath, scattered the powder into the flames, and stepped forward. The fire felt like a warm breeze. He opened his mouth and immediately swallowed a lot of hot ash. Diagon Alley, he coughed. It felt as though he were being sucked down a giant drain. He seemed to be spinning very fast. The roaring in his ears was deafening. He tried to keep his eyes open, but the whirl of green flames made him feel sick. Something hard knocked his elbow, and he tucked it in tightly. Still spinning and spinning, now it felt as though cold hands were slapping his face. Squinting through the glasses, he saw a blurred stream of fireplaces and snatched glimpses of rooms beyond. His bacon sandwiches were churning inside him. He closed his eyes again, wishing it would stop, and then he fell face forward into the cold stone, felt the bridge of his glasses snap. Dizzy and bruised, he covered suit. He got gingerly to his feet, holding his broken glasses up to his eyes. He was quite alone, but where he was, he had no idea. All he could tell was that he was standing in a stone fireplace in what looked like a large, dimly lit wizard shop. But nothing in here was ever likely to be on a Hogwarts school list. A glass case nearby held a withering hand on a cushion, a blood-stained pack of cards, and a staring glass eye. Evil-looking masks stared down from the walls. An assortment of human bones lay upon the corner, and rusty spiked instruments hung from the ceiling. Even worse, the dark, narrow street Harry could see. Even worse, the dark, narrow street Harry could see through the dusty shop window was definitely not Diagon Alley. The sooner he got out of there, the better. No still stinking where it had hit the hearth. Harry made his way very swiftly and silently through the door, but before he got halfway towards it, two people appeared on the other side of the glass. One of them was the very last person Harry wanted to meet when he was lost, covered in soot and wearing soot and soot, yes! Okay, covered in soot and wearing broken glasses, Draco Malfoy. Harry looked quickly around and spotted a large black cabinet to his left. He shot inside and pulled the doors closed, leaving a small crack to peer through. Seconds later, the bell changed, and Harry stepped forward into the shop. The man who followed could only be Draco's father. He had the same pale, pointed face and identical cold gray eyes. Mr. Malfoy crossed the shop, looking lazily at the items on display, and rang a bell on the counter before turning to his son and saying, "Touch nothing, Draco." Malfoy, who had reached for the glass eye, said, "I thought you were going to buy me a present." "I said I would buy you a racing broom," said his father, drumming his fingers on the counter. "What good of that? What's the good of that if I'm not on the house team?" said Malfoy, looking sulkily and bad-tempered. "Harry Potter got Nimbus 2000 last year, special permission from Dumbledore, so he could play for Gryffindor. He's not even that good. It's just because he's famous. Famous for having a stupid scar on his forehead." Malfoy bent down to examine a shelf full of skulls. "Everyone thinks he's so smart. Wonderful Potter with his scar and his broomstick." "You've told me this at least 12 times already," said Mr. Malfoy with a quelling look at his son. "And I would remind you that it is not prudent to appear less than fond of Harry Potter, not when most of our kind regard him as the hero who made the Dark Lord disappear. Ah, Mr. Borgin." A stooping man had appeared behind the counter, smoothing his greasy hair back from his face. "Mr. Malfoy, what a pleasure to see you again," said Mr. Borden, in a voice as oily as his hair. "Delighted. And young Master Malfoy, too. Charmed. How may I be of assistance? I must show you just in today, and very reasonable price." I'm not buying today," said Mr. Borgin. "But selling," said Mr. Malfoy. "Selling?" The smile faded slightly from Mr. Borgin's face. "You have heard, of course, that Ministry is conducting more raids," said Mr. Malfoy, taking a roll of parchment from his inside pocket and unraveling it for Mr. Borgin to read. "I have a few, items at home that might embarrass me if the Ministry were to call." Mr. Borgin fixed a pair of pince nez to his nose and looked down at the list. "The Ministry wouldn't presume to trouble you, sir, surely?" Mr. Malfoy's lips curled. "I have not been visited yet. The name Malfoy still commands a certain respect. Yet the Ministry grows ever more meddlesome. There are rumors about a new Muggle Protection Act. No doubt that the flea-bitten, Muggle-loving fool Arthur Weasley is behind it." Harry felt a hot surge of anger. "And as you see, certain of these poisons might make it appear." "I understand, sir, of course," said Mr. Borgin. "Let me see." "Can I have that?" interrupted Draco, pointing at the withered hand on its cushion. "Ah, the Hand of Glory," said Mr. Borgin, abandoning Mr. Malfoy's list and scurrying over to Draco. Insert a candle, and it gives light only to the holder. Best friend of thieves and plunders. Your son has a fine taste, sir."